morning. Can I see a wave of hands to know that everybody is here? Okay. Thank you, colleagues. So we can get started. Let me first of all apologize because we are starting late, and that's mainly for two reasons. One is that some of us did not manage to keep our promise to be here by 8:30, but the main reason is also that we've been having some technical challenges here. So that has delayed us a bit. It's being fixed by our technical team. Nevertheless, I think we should be ready to get started. We have an online audience participating virtually from different parts of the world. Just a very quick recap of yesterday. Yesterday we had 4 sessions and also a high-level session at the end where we actually got reflections at the high level from permanent secretary level officials from Rwanda, from Kenya, from Zambia, and from Uganda, moderated, of course, by Valerie from the World Bank. Of course, we had the opening session in the morning. We had speeches from our World Bank rep here in Rwanda, UNDP, and of course, the state minister. Today, we pick up from where we started yesterday. So you remember we have 4 themes for this forum. So this morning, we start with our second keynote. We had the first keynote yesterday, which will also conclude our second theme. So the first theme we finished yesterday was on economic case for nature. And then the second theme was on natural capital, data, natural capital accounting, and analysis for biodiversity and ecosystem services. So I would like at this stage, without further delay, to invite Dr. Bekele. So Dr. Bekele will kindly invite our keynote speaker, introduce and invite our keynote speaker this morning. And I think because of the technical challenges, the keynote speaker would have the possibility to just present from the floor. Welcome, Dr. Bekele.
So good morning, everyone. Glad to be here again. So I hope that you are also standing with us, and including those of you who are joining us online. Please don't go away anywhere. We have a lot of things lined up for today, including this exciting, very interesting session today. We are very fortunate and delighted to have Dr. Matthew Agrawal today with us to give this keynote. Matthew is an economist at the University of Cambridge at the Bennett Institute for Public Policy. He leads Bennett Institute's research on sustainability, green productivity, and human well-being. He's also a member of what's called the Productivity Institute in the UK, UK-wide research organization working on measurement and contributions to productivity to human well-being. He's an active member of that, and he's also a senior policy fellow at the Yale University's Tobin Center for Economic Policy. Matthew is an avid researcher, passionate about nature and sustainability issues globally, and has been contributing to the World Bank's Changing Wealth of Nations report as well in terms of really enhancing the methodology on wealth measurement itself. Matthew's research, as I mentioned, focuses a lot on nature and natural capital and social capital, measurement of sustainability, green finance, and productivity. Matthew is a regular contributor to public media as well. He's not quite academic, staying on a corner. He's outspoken generally in terms of communicating his research findings to the media and to the public. He's frequently called upon to comment and provides inputs to various social media and global media outlets, including the BBC, Bloomberg, Channel 4, The Guardian, the New York Times, many more. I'm we are, from the World Bank and from GPS, we are again very happy and delighted, fortunate to have Matthew today to deliver this keynote for the second day on a topic. I hope you will show that on the screen soon. The topic for his keynote is policies for conserving and financing nature in developing countries. And as you can imagine, this is that basically covers the two important themes that we'll be discussing in this second day of the forum on policies, as well as financing for nature. So he will be covering both topics in this keynote speech. And do please welcome Matthew. And Matthew, welcome. Floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for that very generous introduction, Bekele. It is a huge honor and privilege for me to be here in Rwanda. I've wanted to come and see the mountain gorillas since I was a child. And thanks to the World Bank, the government of Rwanda, the United Nations, and all of the organizers and funders and supporters, I've had that chance. It was absolutely stunning. If you can make it happen, do it while you're here. It was useful to me as well because I learned an awful lot about Rwanda, and it reinforced for me the importance of what we're trying to achieve here in this conference and in the GPS more broadly. GDP growth, income growth, this has been the dominant objective of economies and policymakers all around the world for nearly a century. And it has wonderfully transformed the human condition. The pure pursuit of income growth has been accompanied by increased life expectancy, access to education, improved literacy rates, access to healthcare, food security, the ability of people to live, laugh, and love across countries and across cultures. We can share ideas and cuisines and cultures all around the world. And it's a tremendous improvement in the human condition, improvements in all parts of the world. Unequal improvements, absolutely. And there is more work to be done on income growth. The global economy is about 100 trillion US dollars. The global population is about 8 billion people. That works out to a global per capita GDP of about $12,500 per head. There may be people in the room whose travel to this event cost that much. So there is a lot of work to be done on income growth. The challenge, however, is that the pursuit of pure income growth without concern for nature has also released 1.5 trillion tons of CO2 into the atmosphere. It has pushed 1 million species to the brink of extinction. And in just the past 50 years, inside the lifetime of people in this room, we have seen a 70% decline, it's the global average decline, in wildlife populations around the world. And even with the income growth, we still face challenges of inequality along multiple dimensions: income, race, gender, age, within countries and between. And combined, the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, and the inequality crisis that we face has the potential to wipe out that century of economic gain that we've all enjoyed. And so what that means to me is that we need a new economic model. And the way that I like to describe that model is, well, with 20 slides of advanced calculus and mathematics. But I thought I would give you a break, and instead we'll use this one. The way I like to describe the economic model that is fit for the 21st century is to simply imagine that we are running a bakery. The size of the pie that we can produce in the future depends on the stock of ingredients in our pantry. Run out of ingredients, and tomorrow's pie is smaller. Simple. It turns out that that's exactly the principle on which the economy, whether we're talking about local communities, national economies, or the global economy, we work just like the bakery, except that the core ingredients of economic prosperity are not flour, sugar, butter. Clearly, they are capital assets, broadly defined, inclusive of natural capital, of human capital, of physical infrastructure, IT systems, of knowledge capital, the best practices and ways of doing things, and critically, social capital. The amount of trust that we have in each other, in businesses, in governments, the ability of communities and countries to overcome collective action problems. And economics has largely failed on social capital, and the challenges that we face over the 21st century of addressing biodiversity, air quality, water quality in transboundary rivers, climate change, these are collective action problems. And we are going to need to rely on institutions and social capital in order to address them. Income, GDP growth, has focused on the size of the pie. We can grow the pie simply by raiding the pantry, but that is unsustainable. And of these assets, of all of the components of wealth, the one that is in worldwide consistent decline is natural capital. And that's why we are here to speak about natural capital accounting and to speak about financing biodiversity. We need to shift the focus, not just from measuring income and the size of the pie, but to managing the assets in our pantry, managing the social, human, natural, and physical capital. Combined, that will determine what is feasible in the economy. And biodiversity is a major component of natural capital. Now, we face an uphill battle, and the eagle-eyed among you may recognize where this photo is taken. We face an uphill battle when it comes to protecting biodiversity, and we've been here before. I haven't heard much talk about the HE targets. May they rest in peace. Right, so you got that. Unfortunately, yes. We didn't make any of them, but they had all the same goals that we're trying to deal with: sustainable use of nature, income for all, sharing the benefits across communities and countries, protecting biodiversity, enhancing capacity and building implementation through governments. And it hasn't worked. But don't worry, we have a new framework. And I think there are some important things that are different about the current framework and the evidence base for delivering it that should give some optimism. So you'll be familiar with the 23 targets, the 4 goals. I'm going to focus on just a couple of them here, and I give thank you to Tijen for helping me with this slide. The key ones that I'm interested in are 30 by 30, sustainable use of the ecosystem services, and critically, integrating biodiversity into policies, not just in environmental policy, but across the board. What I mean here is that biodiversity has a role to play in education, and the schools that I saw around Volcanoes National Park are leading in conservation education here in Rwanda. Biodiversity has a role to play in human health. The pandemic we've just faced is a biodiversity story. It is not a climate change story. It is a biodiversity story. It has a role to play in the design and delivery of infrastructure, and it has a role to play in the regulation of the financial system. Biodiversity must be integrated in policy across the board. And of course, to deliver that, we need to mobilize the capacity and the finance. And we've got some tools available to us to help with this. I apologize for that. We saw yesterday the economic case for nature, this brilliant report. It is the first time that I've ever seen the integration of an ecosystem service valuation model with a CGE model. That is groundbreaking work and is really very important. We know that we can do the valuation of the ecosystem services. We can integrate that into cost-benefit analysis for project planning. This is real applied, boots-on-the-ground work. And the natural capital accounts are going to be the things that we rely on to demonstrate the evidence base for green finance. Without the data, we cannot evidence the fact that progress has been made, and with that data, we will be able to identify the priority targets for investment. Now, who's seen this map or something like it before? Nobody? Come on. You've seen this map. What am I showing in red here? This is where the world's biodiversity lives. So in any case, that map was showing you where the world's biodiversity lives. Okay? Now, this talk is supposed to be about finance for biodiversity. Now I'm going to show you the top 10 financial centers in the world. And the thing that you learn from this slide is that finance lives where biodiversity does not. And that's one of the reasons that we're facing an uphill battle. Okay? I don't think I've ever had a disco ball in a talk before. That's impressive. Thank you. So the challenge is, how do we get the finance from these financial centers to allocate to investment projects in these biodiversity hotspots? Now, every economist is two-handed. You know the joke about the one-handed economist? The president brought an economist in to give him some advice. The economist gave his advice, but then said, on the other hand, and then gave him exactly the opposite advice. And so the president demanded a one-handed economist so that he couldn't use the other hand. I told you this was a map of biodiversity hotspots and financial centers. And technically, that's exactly what it is. But the way I'd like you to think about it instead is that this is a map of an implicit subsidy from these biodiversity hotspots in red to the rest of the world here in white. And the reason I think that's an implicit subsidy is that biodiversity is a global public good. Every person, every company, every business, every country depends on the global stock of biodiversity. And they all benefit from it. But they don't all pay for it. Which means that there is an implicit subsidy. The value of those benefits from biodiversity are going from these biodiversity hotspots to the financial centers. And so that means that we have to find a new way of developing the incentives to monetize that biodiversity, to protect it and conserve it and expand it in those hotspots and elsewhere across the world. But it's hard, right? If there's all this value from biodiversity and markets are good at exploiting value, why do we need to do anything? Why can't the market just fix it? Well, the issue is that biodiversity is a public good. The benefits that we get accrue publicly, and it is impossible for me to prevent any of you from benefiting. More importantly, it is impossible for me to force any of you to pay me for the benefits that you get from that biodiversity, which means that I will underinvest and underprovide biodiversity and the habitats in which it lives. And so we have a free rider problem. The financial centers are free riding on the biodiversity in the rest of the world. So what do we do? Well, we can see what private finance can offer, what it can deliver. And there are some really important case studies, including here in Rwanda and in Uganda and in other parts across the GPS portfolio, where private finance is able to invest and protect and conserve ecosystems, and therefore the biodiversity within them. But it tends to be fairly small scale. It tends to be in places where biodiversity is a co-benefit of other market-provided goods and services. So we're talking about ecotourism, well-managed trophy hunting, and land values, property values that rise because I stayed in a hotel next to Volcanoes National Park. That hotel probably cost more than if I had stayed somewhere else without the gorillas and the hiking track and all of that complementary infrastructure. So there are some places where private finance can really deliver, and we see the mountain gorilla population is one of the only gorilla populations that is growing globally. So there can be real success stories. But it's still a public good. It'll still be underprovided by the market. And so there has to be a backstop, and that is governments. There's a principle of public money for public goods. And so we're going to have to deliver that as well. And there are a range of policy options around public subsidies, regulations and bans of harmful practices, taxes, auctions, debt for nature swaps, critically, payments for ecosystem services. And here I want to echo something that we've discussed a little bit throughout yesterday's conversations. It's not good enough just to do the right thing. investing in biodiversity, subsidizing biodiversity investments. We must also stop doing the wrong thing. And we have, by some estimates, $1.5 to $2 trillion every year of environmentally harmful subsidies being provided by governments. Even if governments were to start investing in expanding protected areas to meet the 30 by 30 target, as long as we are pouring $2 trillion a year into harmful subsidies, direct harmful subsidies, we will not be able to overcome and correct this and turn the ship around. So it's not good enough just to do the right thing, we must also stop doing the wrong thing. And one of the key places to do this is using payments for ecosystem services. We can repurpose agricultural subsidies, for instance, in order to get farmers to find an incentive to provide environmental goods. And there are examples of this around the world. China has the largest payments for ecosystem service program in the world, and it is through their agricultural subsidy. In the UK, we're revamping all of our agricultural subsidies in order to pay farmers for the environmental benefits that they can generate. That's really interesting as an economist, because it's not new money. It's the same money, just repurposed. It's not an extra strain on the fiscal budget. It's just repurposing it for better economic and environmental outcomes. Now, we've spoken a bit about public issues, private issues. I've been doing this for a little while, not so long as some of you, of course. And in my experience, I find we get this three-way finger pointing. Governments will tell me, it's not really us, it's the private sector. Agriculture is a private sector business. And it's the private sector that has to change, and it's consumers that have to purchase green goods and stop purchasing the environmentally damaging goods. But then the governments don't enforce the environmental regulation, they miss the HE targets, and they fund the harmful subsidies anyway. The public, those of us who are just citizens, we say, well, actually, it's governments that need to clean up. They need to regulate, they need to enforce. Or it's businesses that need to develop new practices, new products that are more environmentally friendly. But then the public, we won't change our lifestyle, we don't pay more for green, we don't vote for parties that support nature when we get a chance at the ballot box. Businesses, on the other hand, say, actually, it's not really us. We're just following the rules set by government, we're responding to consumer demand, but they still depend on those subsidies and they still fund greenwash. And as long as we have this three-way sort of shirking of blame, I think we have a major uphill battle here. But the economic fact is that somebody always pays. When it comes to the degradation of nature, whether we're talking about the farmers who face tighter margins, the companies who might lose profits or face stricter regulation, the consumers who may suffer through lower quality goods or higher prices, maybe we don't put the burden on any of them, we just do it on the public through public taxation. When it comes to the degradation of nature, somebody always pays. And if it's not the early parts of the supply chain, if it's not the businesses, it's not the consumers, and it's not the taxpayer, then the one who pays is nature itself and future generations. Somebody always pays. Which means that policy lets us decide who pays. That's the role of the government, and that's the role of the financial system. There's a lot of support for polluter pays, but the vast majority of the transactions you and I will ever encounter are beneficiary pays. I benefit from the coffee, so I pay for it. And the principle that we would like to achieve in our policies is to get the greatest good, the greatest bang for our buck. So how much are we going to have to pay? Well, estimates are 600 to 800 billion annually to achieve the targets of the biodiversity framework. Is it worth it? Well, the estimates from the Economic Case for Nature suggest that we're looking at nearly 3 trillion of losses if we don't make these investments. So that's a good return on investment. We should be making it. And that 600 to 800 billion a year is a lot less than the harmful subsidies that we're already providing. So what does the evidence tell us? What are the solutions and the policies that actually work? Well, we can think about private actors and public actors, private finance and public finance, and we can think about voluntary markets and we can think about compliance and mandatory regulations. Everybody wants to be in the top right, in the top left here. Yes, everybody wants to let the private market take it. And there are opportunities. They have a good impact on biodiversity gain. They work where there are strong expected financial returns. And we're talking about ecosystems, ecotourism, offsets, trophy hunting, etc. And there's some good examples here. The challenge, though, is that they tend to be small in geographic scale, and they tend to be small in terms of the global impact on biodiversity. So let's think about public and voluntary instead. So here what we're talking about is debt for nature swaps, green bonds, payments for ecosystem services. They can have large impact, but there are going to be trade-offs as well. The volumes of money can be large. That's good for financing biodiversity, but it's bad for the public budgets. The expected financial returns are mixed. And sometimes you get really good returns. And there can be trade-offs between economic outcomes and social outcomes. We can think about private and compliance. Here we see huge potential biodiversity gain. We're talking about taxes, permit schemes, offsets, legal liabilities, mandatory regulations. These can have a huge impact, but there's not very much evidence of the financial system trying to deliver these sorts of environmental outcomes. And we can think about public and compliance. This means, let's say we're interested in our infrastructure investment portfolio over the next decades. Well, why don't we enshrine in law that those infrastructure investments have to have a positive impact on biodiversity? We have international agreements that we should be honoring, and these can have very strong impacts as well. But again, the evidence is a little bit mixed. It only works if we actually follow through. So I'm just going to close up in about a minute. So what are some of the best practices when we survey the literature and we see the experiences around the world? Well, best practices for private finance: tie the biodiversity goods to market goods and services. Diversify and invest in the complementary assets. So it's great to have the rich ecosystems, but you need to have the infrastructure for the ecotourism alongside it. You need to have the skills. And one of the fastest things that's going to drive private markets away is regulatory instability and political instability. So we need to deliver that in stable terms. The big obstacles that we face across the board are ground truthing. We need to provide the evidence base, and that's what natural capital accounts can do for us. We have to be willing to learn publicly. Not every investment in biodiversity is going to deliver the desired outcomes. We have to allow ourselves to make mistakes and to learn from them. We need to share and compile the best evidence and data, and we need to act now. The costs of failing to do so vastly outweigh the costs of investing in conserving nature, and they're only going to grow. The terms of trade, the debt costs, the debt financing costs are only going to deteriorate if economies start to suffer the consequences of climate change and biodiversity loss. So the conclusions: measure what matters, manage the entire portfolio, and understand that private finance has an important role to play, but it needs to be backed by government, and it needs to have carrot and stick involved. Thank you.
Thanks again, Matthew, for this very exciting, thoughtful, thought-provoking keynote. I did enjoy it in many ways. It's very, very useful. It really provided, I think, the broader framework for our conversation for much of the day today. So I have just a couple of, we have about 5-10 minutes to have a brief discussion on a keynote. I'll just start with one question, and then maybe we'll open it for if there are any comments or questions from the floor as well. So broadly, I think this is the framework and the public-private actors and the kinds of policies that you showed, the mix of policy instruments that could be used makes a lot of sense overall. I wanted to kind of maybe reflect a little bit and kind of see in the context of many developing countries and in the interest of biodiversity-related issues that we discuss now, my hunch is that we need a mix of those. We need the left corner, the right upper corner, the lower corner. All the corners are likely to be relevant even in a given country. So it's maybe up to a particular government to find the right mix of these different types of instruments which might be relevant in each context. And of course, evidence is still limited, but there's quite a bit that is emerging, and I think we need to learn by doing this in practice as well. So if you can just comment a little bit about how developing countries might be able to kind of optimize between this different instruments that might be available in terms of filling the gaps for the private sector to come in voluntarily or through compliance strategies, or when both fail, the public sector to come in and also fill the gap. And I think particularly the public sector's role, I suspect, is going to be much more relevant in the context of global commons, regional commons, things are, where, property rights issues particularly fail. I think it would be important to kind of keep that in mind as well. The other comment is also on the potential for piggybacking biodiversity values, building biodiversity values into traded commodities, traded goods and services that might be available. And of course, carbon comes into mind because, carbon markets seem to function well. They are growing. There is a global framework for that. And now we have the global biodiversity framework as well. There is a lot of discussion about linking biodiversity markets, creating biodiversity markets or building those values of biodiversity into carbon. That might be an issue, if you can just comment on that. But also, agricultural commodities, think of coffee. Rwanda is a country which exports, for example, coffee, tea, or cocoa, which grow in the forest. Shade coffee has value, premium values with it. But just because it grows under tree cover and it attracts premium because of the taste plus the biodiversity values associated with it as well. So cocoa, coffee, tea, maybe bananas, other types of agricultural products which are traded could possibly be linked with biodiversity, and I think there is a niche market which can potentially grow as well. And I think private sector is also kind of developing sustainability standards, especially where nature-related risks matter, and they make a difference in terms of financial returns for the private sector. Private sector is likely voluntarily going to invest in terms of at least limiting the negative footprints of agricultural commodities to commodity supply chains, et cetera, in terms of limiting the environmental and biodiversity impacts of those activities. So maybe there are also positive examples, bright spots around the world in terms of really bringing voluntary private sector investment into that, and of course supporting it with blended finance, redirecting subsidies, et cetera, like we discussed. And now, of course, we have also what is called, the TNFD, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, and the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which is actually a voluntary coalition of private sector businesses which are interested in terms of disclosing, the risks and impacts and dependencies of companies and businesses on nature. So I think there is a bit of private sector possibilities and potentially coming in terms of maybe creating the biodiversity, demand for biodiversity credits maybe, but at least in terms of limiting, again, the negative environmental impacts of private sector. So just if you can just comment on that as we maybe collect also additional questions from the floor, that would be good. Thank you. Thank you, Matthew. Please.
Do I comment from there?
Yeah,
or
you
is...
can come in here.
Okay, all right. That might be easier.
Or does this work?
Well,
thank you very much. Those are excellent questions. I'll try and distill. We could have an entire conference just on those. I'll try and distill just a couple of points. On the 4 quadrants, absolutely, we need action across all of them. We need public voluntary, we need private voluntary. We need public compliance, we need private compliance. All areas of that quadrant need to be pursued. The challenge for private finance is the evidence that I've seen working with banks who've developed private finance investment mechanisms to protect biodiversity is that they tend only to really work where there's a strong, quick financial return for the private investor. That's where these things play out quite well. So that's the ecotourism, the well-managed trophy hunting, land values, etc. Private finance will only deliver if there is a good economic return. Now, there are ways to use blended finance, and I know that GPS is leading on this in many ways, where we combine either philanthropic contributions or public contributions with private finance in an attempt to de-risk the costs and the investments for the private sector. And that can be a great way of leveraging and crowding in private investment. And so there are a couple of different themes that are pursued here. Often seniority. So we're going to invest in a project. There are going to be multiple investors. Some of them will be philanthropic, some of them public, but much of it private. And the returns from the project can be allocated equally across those investors, or we could give the private sector investors seniority. So they're the first ones to get the returns back. And that can de-risk and reduce some of the costs and improve the expected return for private finance. There's another, which is a guaranteed backstop return. If you invest in this, we can guarantee you at least 2%, but hopefully we get more, and then the public finance is just to cover that. There are a range of other initiatives as well. I think that one of the things that's particularly important is investing in the human capital and the skills in the financial sector. And that's something that I think we could do quite well here. When I go around and speak to banks at large, most people have never heard of natural capital. But there are a few in the sector who are really up on this and really excited about it. We need to support them in spreading this message and sharing the fact that nature is an asset, and we can invest in it, and we can generate a return.
Thank you. Yes, let me see if there are any comments from the floor. One question. Yes, please, a question at the back, very quickly. I'll take only 2 questions. One at the back and one on the left side here.
Thank you. Mine is just to highlight an aspect you mentioned about social capital and natural capital. Although we all say that this framework, biodiversity, is under finance, but my feeling is that social capital is really the orphans on all the capitals we mentioned. Because just to give an example, if we want to protect biodiversity in Rwanda, how many people remember to teach the child the name of the species they learned from their parents? So how can you restore the species if we don't even remember the names? So it's really a big chain, and you hardly see an NGO financing only social capital. So it says a lot about underfinancing the social capital. Thank you.
Okay, let's just collect a second question as well, so we can answer them together.
Good morning. Okay, I want to say thank you. Thank you to everyone. Thank you to World Bank. Thank you to all participants for being here. My question have to do with, my name is Emmanuel Steven Kamara, and I have a question, and it have to do with, I want to know what are some of those challenges that developed countries face in investing in natural capital based on their private sector investment. Thank you.
I'm not sure we understood the question. Can you just,
Okay. I said, what are some of those challenges that developed countries face in investing in natural capital based on the private sector investment?
Yeah. Yep. So both are really important questions and comments. I completely agree with you on social capital being key to unlocking this, and education being a really important component of it. I'm at the University of Cambridge. It's a pretty good educational institution. I would not want to compete in an exam against the middle school students that I saw in Kinigi this past weekend about the ecosystems there. I bet you they know more about those ecosystems than I do. And I think that's really important. Investing in education and incorporating biodiversity into that is hugely, hugely important. And it's important for the economic outcomes too, because that's where the human capital and the skills come. People tip more and pay more for an educated guide who can explain to them about the ecosystems. That's really important. So I completely agree with you there. On developed countries and the challenges that they face in generating private sector finance for biodiversity, this is where I'm going to go off script and get myself in trouble. Let's look at the UK. We don't have that much biodiversity left. We've destroyed it over thousands of years. So if we are going to invest in it, there's just not that much to conserve. We have to do entirely new restoration. We face the same trade-offs that you're going to face here, the land use trade-off. In the UK, it's a tiny country. Land is used for agriculture, that's 75% of the surface area, or it's used for housing and urban developments. Right? And there is a trade-off. Make no mistake. Every component of this is going to involve trade-offs. Every penny that we spend in expanding a national park is a penny that we have not spent on educating and empowering women and girls. There will be trade-offs, but the economic consequences of failing to protect natural capital, of raiding our economic pantry, means that the ability of governments to support investments across the board will be affected.
Thank you very much. I think let's end it there. Thank you so much, Matthew. I know there are a few more questions as well, but just in the interest of time, let's leave it there. Let's give a big round of applause for Matthew for this exacting talk. Thank you so much. And back to Philip now. Thank you.
Yeah, once again, thank you, Matthew. I hope you're around.
I am, absolutely.
Because I see there's a lot of lot of interest in your talk, and I'm sure colleagues would like to follow up with questions. Can we give a round of applause to Bekele for the facilitation? Thank you, Dr. Bekele. So we now move over to the third theme of the conference, getting the incentives right for biodiversity conservation, natural progression, to the discussions we've had here about subsidies and other instruments that can help sort of promote biodiversity conservation. And we'll start with session 5. So I would like, of course, to invite our colleague, Dr. Uju Dim, who is going to moderate this session. And I think, Dr. Uju, I'll let you invite your presenters and panelists. Is that right? Yeah, and I know you're worried about time. Just to assure you, you still have your 80 minutes, and then we'll find somehow to fix the time that we have overrun. So welcome to the stage.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to those online. Good to see you again, and I'm happy to welcome you to session 5, which is getting the incentives right for biodiversity conservation. And this is a very, very exciting one. And you guys know why? Don't worry, I'll tell you. It's because this is the only session in this forum that is looking at non-renewable natural capital. And it fits well into the conversations which we had yesterday, where we learned that in order for us to successfully implement the global biodiversity framework, we need to adopt a whole-of-government approach where we would take into account and work across different ministries and sectors. So although a lot of the work we do is focused on renewable natural capital, we heard from the keynotes today that it is not enough to do the right thing. It is not enough to invest or focus on biodiversity conservation. You also have to stop doing the wrong thing. So we need to work on understanding what the difference or the impact of diversifying the economy from extractive sectors are. Because several of the developing countries are reliant on the extractive sectors. So take, for instance, Nigeria, my home country. 80% of the revenues, total government revenues, are generated from the oil and gas sector. The case is similar in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where 95% of their export earnings is from the mining sector. But this is not limited to African countries, because the case is the same when you think about Bolivia, Yemen, Venezuela, and so on. So what this session does is that it explores specific policy reforms aimed at shifting incentives for resource users, and it will examine economy-wide asset diversification strategies and policies that can contribute to national biodiversity and climate goals. So we have a very great mix of presentations today, and I would introduce the speakers based on how they would make their presentations. So our first speaker would be Dr. Charlotte de Fontauber. She is a senior fisheries specialist in the Southeastern African region at the World Bank. And she'll be presenting on detox development, repurposing fisheries subsidies. Our second speaker would be Professor Tofin Harding. He's the holder of the Equinor Chair in Economics at the Norwegian School of Economics. And he'll be presenting on the topic, the role of non-renewable natural capital in diversification policies for sustainability and nature conservation. Our third and final speaker would be Ms. Tijen Harin. She's a senior environmental economist at the World Bank, and she'll tell us about her work on nature-aware macroeconomic models to evaluate policy options. So I would be the timekeeper. And in terms of timing, each of the presenters have 15 minutes each to make their presentation. And since we are running short on time, I would be quite strict with the timing. So I have some time cards, which they know about, and I will show them time at 5 minutes and at 1 minute. So I urge you to keep your presentation short and sweet. So thank you. I invite Dr. Charlotte to present our work.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good morning. Habari. Bonjour. No, I'm not getting a reaction. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. Good evening to those of us who are online. Thank you very much to the organizers, and it's a pleasure to be here today. I have to confess, I was a little bit upset when I heard Martin's presentation, because I thought it was terribly unfair for me to have to follow in his footsteps and the fantastic job that he did. That being said, I would like to thank him very much for the perfect tee-up for our conversation now, which is on subsidies, and specifically fishery subsidies. We didn't check the queue. Oh, there it is. My name is Charlotte de Fontauber. I'm a senior fisheries specialist, and I'm based in Washington, D.C. The whole part of my presentation that was going to be about why we need to look at subsidies has now been covered by Martin. Thank you very much. And I'm going to switch next to the next slide. I couldn't do a better job than he did. And explain a little bit about why we are looking at, where we were looking at fishery subsidies. I noticed throughout the proceedings yesterday and today we've been hearing about subsidies, which is this bit of a mystery, but I think instinctively everybody understands that subsidies that are supposed to be something for good turn out to be something that undermines the environment. So specifically in this context, we look at the issue of environmentally harmful subsidies. So I was working with a group of economists at the World Bank where we looked at various subsidies, and specifically I looked at fisheries in a way of addressing the ocean part of the planet. We just heard that this is the first presentation looking at non-renewable resources, and I think this is going to be the first presentation looking at marine resources. So when we decided to look at the issue, it was not just an issue of looking at all subsidies, but rather really focusing on the harmful ones. And again, I'm going to be quite opportunistic, and I'm going to pick up on some of the things that Martin said, which is, what do we do about those subsidies and how do we repurpose them? So you're not going to hear me say that governments need to get out of the fisheries business, but rather that the tremendous amounts that are being spent on fishery subsidies can and should be repurposed to achieve better results. We looked at it in the global context, and we did this through a series of models. So in terms of where we got to this issue, the bank for the last 20 or so years has been looking at economics of subsidies. And the most recent exercise we did was a modeling exercise on the impact of overfishing, economic impacts of overfishing. And my predecessor came up with this brilliant title for the first report, which is the sunken billions, which refers to the billions of dollars that are sunk every year in foregone benefits because we do not manage fisheries properly. So I'm going to start on a bit of a negative note, which is to remind everybody that we have a global crisis on fisheries, a global crisis of overfishing, which is linked directly to overcapacity. And unfortunately, the graph on the right, the map on the right, reminds us that climate change is going to wreak even further havoc in terms of what we can expect from the fishery standpoint. If you think, well, this is about fisheries, why do I care about fisheries? Again, from a global standpoint, I'd like to remind everybody that according to the FAO, 1 in 10 people in the world depend directly or indirectly on fisheries, marine and continental, capture, aquaculture, processing, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, a tremendous importance from a food security perspective. So this sunken billion, whoops, I'm cutting myself off. This sunken billion report that we referred to looks specifically, this is a very clever trick that the World Bank has, is let's look at the numbers, let's look at the dollars. This is the best way we have of addressing, of capturing everybody's attention. So I'm going to skip to the good part, which is that every year in excess of $80 billion are foregone to overfishing and overcapacity. So that's the catchy figure, if you will, that we use in order to get decision makers' attention. And of course, those sunken billions are spread very dispersely throughout the world. So it's not, even though it's a global problem, the problem is going to be felt differently in different regions. And now I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this slide, which is not the one I usually focus on because I don't usually talk about biodiversity. And I'm going to do a little bit of ecology and math with everyone. We look specifically at a very, very simple proxy, which is the level of fishing and the level of capacity with an impact on the fish biomass. Okay, so everybody here has a little bit of an understanding of biodiversity and biomass, and we looked specifically at what is going to happen on fish in the ocean if we reduce fishing. We also say that reducing fishing means reducing capacity, but let's just look at what would happen if we didn't fish the way we do, which is a race to fishing, which is every country trying to beat the other. For those of you who don't know, a lot of fishing happens beyond zones of national jurisdiction, where yesterday one of the participants referred to this phenomenon, which is racing to capture the very last resources available, and Martin referred to this as well, the issue of the free riders. So if I decide to stop fishing, what is going to stop someone else to go fishing, and this sort of race to the bottom? So what happens if we achieved a reduction of 40% in fishing effort? So the fish biomass, so think about it, we reduce fishing by 40%, the fish biomass almost triples from 215 to 580 million tons, almost a triple. Many, many, many more fish in the sea. That also means that the level of fishing becomes much more efficient. If you think about it, if you're a fisherman, if there's few fish, you have to go further, you have to spend more money, more time to catch the fish. If there are more fish out there, you're going to be much more efficient and you're going to go out and catch more fish. Pretty straightforward. But what also happens is it's not just volume. Not only do you have more fish, but you have bigger fish. They have time to reproduce, and bigger fish fetch higher prices. So the sort of irony, or sometimes it's difficult to understand, but you can catch more fish by fishing less. So if you had X number of days of fishing, you're going to be able to have X minus whatever factor, and you're actually going to be able to catch more. And then we narrowed it down to some economic benefit valuation, and we went from about $3 billion a year globally in fisheries benefits to in excess of 80 billion. So for 2012, the number was 86, the number varies. So again, you're gonna ask, what does this have to do with us? And actually, what we decided to think about is, so we know there's overfishing and we know there's overcapacity, which translates into too many boats catching too few fish. What is driving this? Why is it, and what we looked at in economic terms is that basically, because we are foregoing economic benefits, it doesn't make sense from an economic standpoint. So how do we arrive to this irrational economic result, which is we're not doing what's best for us economically, and of course not what's best for the planet. And the issue is subsidies. So actually, what we decided to do is we worked with the University of British Columbia, and we commissioned a number of models, 3 models, where we compared situations in the Mauritanian EEZ, which is interesting because it has very developed artisanal small-scale fisheries and large-scale industrialized foreign fleets. We looked at the East China Sea, and we looked at the northern South China Sea. And the question that we asked is, what is the level of subsidies? What would happen if we reduce subsidies? And perhaps more interestingly, is the problem really subsidies, or is the problem the issue of open access in fisheries? So basically, fisheries management regime. So we wanted to compare the 2 sets of explanations that could help us understand what is going on, what fisheries are doing, and what would happen if we were able to reduce or, remember, repurpose these subsidies. And then, interestingly enough, we looked at 3 different policy scenarios, because when you talk about fisheries, you have to be very cognizant of the fact that decision makers are going to actually have different objectives. So in this particular case, we were very, very clear. For each of the geographic situations that I mentioned, we looked at what exactly are your economic objectives. So we are looking at economic optimization, maximizing your rent. We are looking at ecological optimization, what is happening to the species, to the biomass, to the biodiversity in the water, and what happens from a social standpoint, from a jobs growth creation. Now, we are not in any way, shape, or form taking any priority between these 3 objectives, but I think it's very, very interesting if from the start we recognize that different decision makers, usually depending on different stages of the management of the fishery, have different objectives. I worked in the Pacific, which has an incredibly successful fishery, where the countries got together and organized themselves and achieved some very good results according to their objectives. And they were confronted to others who meant very well, who came in and said, you know what, we can really maximize your rent. We can do better. We can get more money. And that was not helpful because their priority was job creation. So I'm not going to go too much into the results. I will share the reference to the report, but just to see that in each region we had different sets of results from ecological, social, and economic. But what we found that was very important, and this is where I would like to finish my talk, is that we have to be very careful of unintended consequences in that we didn't really get the exact results that we were expecting. Let me give you one example to illustrate my point. In the case of Mauritania, we were able to show that if you only repurpose, or if you repurpose both artisanal fisheries and industrialized fisheries, you get suboptimal results, everybody loses. Whereas if you're able to repurpose the industrialized fisheries and protect the artisanal fisheries, both sets of fisheries actually benefit. So think about it. You change the subsidies to the industrialized, you don't change the ones to the artisanal, and both fisheries actually benefit. So I think that was a big lesson in terms of be very, very careful about unintended consequences. When you talk about reforming subsidies, remember you're dealing with people whose livelihoods are at stake, so you have to be very careful how you do this. And then we realized that the fine balance that I was talking about at the start of my presentation, how much is subsidies and how much is management, very economic, sorry Martin, with the two hands, it depends. On the one hand and on the other hand. And by this, I mean the results are going to be different if you're talking about demersal fisheries, pelagic fisheries, artisanal fisheries. So I think, if anything, what this report showed is that you have to be, there's great potential that can be achieved if you're able to influence the way your subsidies are used, but you have to be very, very careful about unintended consequences. And I have to say that at the end of the day, we had to recognize that just addressing subsidies is not going to solve the crisis of global fishing, and you really have to stick always to the issue of open access and the management regimes. So moving forward, we recognize that the whole issue of subsidies are poorly understood. We try to shed some light on what can and cannot be done. I think again and again, let's be very, very careful about what we actually promise, what we say we can achieve, and what we can actually achieve. Perhaps the most important point is the last one. When we're talking about repurposing subsidies, remember you are dealing with people's lives. The impacts are likely to be tremendous. And I would just add, to finish, that the WTO has just adopted its first environmental agreement on fisheries, and the World Bank is working hand in glove with our clients to help them implement this agreement and address overfishing through subsidies. Thank you very much.
So there was a mic here, but okay, I can probably. You have a mic? Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. I may have to look at my slides. So thank you for the invitation. So if I can get up the slides, that would be great. So my talk is going to be, I think, a bit more from the macro point of view. Compared to many of the other talks, perhaps. So I hope that's a complementary perspective. The talk is called The Amazonian Disease. And can I get the slides up, please? There it is. So the title plays on something that is called the Dutch disease. And that is kind of a well-known disease among economists working on non-renewable resources, like oil and gas in particular. And it is has its name from the Netherlands, which found gas in Groningen, as we know, in 1959, started to spend the money in the Netherlands, and then the economy changed. And it changed in a particular way, in the sense that the previous traded sector, the exporting sector, say, met challenges. Cost increased, and it was harder to do, the traditional exports. We can see traces of this sort of disease also when it comes to the protection of renewable resources. And sometimes what's going on is almost too obvious for us researchers to actually write papers about it. Some of the work I'm going to present today is an attempt to kind of write a paper on something that is perhaps a bit obvious, but we think is actually important part of the understanding of what has happened to forests around the world, especially over the last 2 decades. So some of the stuff I'm going, everything I'm going to say is developed together with great colleagues. James Cust is at Future and also has been at the World Bank for many years. Hannah Krings used to be a PhD student in Aachen in Germany, and now she's in the German Aerospace Center, and then Alexis Rivera Balestros at the World Bank. So let me motivate the talk with perhaps 2 anecdotes. So one is about Brazil. Okay, so many of you would know that Brazil was very successful during Lula's first period in reducing deforestation. And many of us have pointed to policies. There's been a lot of work, looking at the different policy packages that Lula and his government introduced. And the general conclusion is that many of these policies were successful. At the same time as Lula rolled out all these policies, there was a commodity boom. Prices on oil and gas and also minerals were increasing and increasing up to the financial crisis. And some of the work I'm going to talk about today is really about what is the effect of that kind of commodity boom on the forests. Okay, so we would argue that some of these great declines in deforestation rates in Brazil is due to this boom in prices on non-renewable resources. Okay, and another anecdote, which is a bit more local. I teach at the master's program in Angola sometimes, and there are many established economists taking that program, working for the government in different ministries, etc. And when I asked them about local food, they said, we don't produce so much local food here in Angola anymore. We used to do it, but now, after oil and gas, it's not so profitable anymore. So we import most of it. And this is an anecdote, take it for what it is. But the point of much of the stuff I'm going to talk today is that when you develop the oil and gas sector, something happens with the competitiveness of the other sectors, and that is going to have consequences for the forest. So in some sense, some of the commodity booms may have saved a lot of forests, a lot of renewable resources. A decline in prices on, for example, oil and gas can do the opposite. It can actually threaten then and increase deforestation. So, if I figure how to change the slides. So to motivate very quickly, I don't have a lot of time. The world has already lost half of its forests, and annual global deforestation is about the area of the UK. And many of you know more about these ecosystems than me, and we know they are under pressure. If we look at sub-Saharan Africa, for example, we see that annual deforestation has increased over the last 2 decades, and it actually the blue one to the right here shows that sub-Saharan Africa had the fastest acceleration and 3 times higher deforestation post the boom that we're going to talk about in this presentation. The boom ended kind of in 2014. We know the oil price crash. Up to then, there was kind of a boom. And after that, we saw the deforestation increase quite a lot in sub-Saharan Africa. The question is partly why. This presentation is about how the renewable natural capital may be affected by the non-renewable natural capital. So there may be these interactions within the natural capital that we think is very important. This slide is this picture is from chapter 11 in the Changing Wealth of Nations in 2011, and it shows that fossil fuel producers. So the x-axis here, the horizontal axis shows the fossil fuel wealth share of total wealth. And then the vertical axis shows the change in renewable natural capital. And what we see is that in many of these countries, we see that the natural capital, the renewable natural capital was actually in decline per capita. So that is kind of an interesting observation. Perhaps we wouldn't argue there's a super strong correlation here, but nevertheless, we see that many of these producers of, or exporters or extractors of non-renewables did actually have a decline in the renewable capital. Okay. And the last bullet point here says, if you look at, for example, 6 sub-Saharan African countries listed here in the parentheses in the second bullet point, if we look at, you know, in this chapter at least, they argue that key causes for the loss of the forest assets or the loss in the renewable capital is loss of forest assets, but also loss of value of croplands. And this is a key thing here. The value of cropland is related to, especially if you do export, is related to the real exchange rate, which is going to be affected by the export of natural or oil and gas. This table is quite fascinating. So we look into what happened after the oil price crashed in 2014. And just doing something super simple, just looking at change in deforestation. Okay, so that is, we have the 2013, in the second column here, is the deforestation in 2013, the year before the before the crash in the oil price. And then 2016, a couple of years after, we have the deforestation in the third column. And then we see the fourth column here, we see the percentage change. Okay, and the last column shows whether this country is an oil exporter. So the point is that we saw a huge increase in deforestation in some of these oil exporting countries. So Brazil, for example, 176% increase in deforestation. Indonesia, DRC, Bolivia, many of these countries had actually done very high increases in deforestation. Globally, we saw the deforestation increasing from 200,000 square kilometers approximately before the, or in 2013, before the crash, up to 300,000. So it's a 50% increase. So it's a massive increase. It's almost too big to, you know, believe the numbers. And we also see then, it's an interesting observation that 70% of the world's tropical forests are found among major oil and mineral exporters. So this may be quite important for the big picture in deforestation. If we zoom into a case study, let's go to Brazil. We here show the monthly data for the oil price in blue here. So we see it falls sharply in 2014. And then the red is the deforestation rates. So we see kind of that in the period after the crash, where the blue is relatively low here, we see that the deforestation picked up, was higher than in the period before. And then also COVID was a new crash in the oil price, and we saw it picked up again. Okay, so 1 minute left. So time flies. We have other examples. This is an event study showing, you know, we do this a bit more formally. We find that actually this crash in the prices can explain something like, you know, we find an increase in deforestation of about 50%. So it seems to be in the data. So the mechanism here is, in some sense, the Dutch disease in reverse. So I told you about the Netherlands. You know, they found gas, started to spend some of the money. That made their currency more expensive, so their other export products less competitive. If you do it in the reverse, you're going to have your other export products more competitive. If you do agriculture for exports, that's going to be more competitive. It's going to be more profitable for you to do large-scale export-oriented agriculture when the currency is cheap. So that's really the mechanism we have in mind here, and that's what we think is part of this increase in deforestation after 2015. So then, of course, a question is, what's going to fix it? I don't have the answer. It's a big kind of macro relative price kind of story. It's not necessarily that easy to fix with policy. I think at least, we should know about this. These are strong forces. We have other work. This is an example of a work we published last year where we looked into, some regulation. So, of course, we have heard a lot of different things about regulation here. That is definitely one tool in our toolbox. We have, in this paper, compared what we call like public governance. Think about, the traditional institutional measures like democracy, etc., like that. And then corporate governance, think ESG. And we tried to look into whether private companies that claim to be, committed to ESG, if they have less of a local footprint when they operate and in forests, when they look for oil in forests, okay? And, the very short version of this paper is that we find that it really matters what kind of political institutions you have. The public governance is really important. The corporate governance, we don't really find that it makes a difference. So that is, we can't necessarily rely on sort of these private initiatives, perhaps. It seems to be necessary with some, public regulation. Then the last slide here is about, we talked about the interaction between the renewables and non-renewables. It is an important message, as I understand it. I wouldn't be the expert in the room on this changing wealth of nations, obviously. But an important message I understand that comes out is that, yes, rich countries have a relatively smaller share of their wealth in renewables. However, their value, absolute value, is also higher of renewables than in poorer countries. So that I think is important, and I think it speaks a bit to the pie analogy we heard in the great keynote earlier today. I think that analogy is a little bit dangerous, to be honest. We may be able to, maybe we can discuss that later, hopefully. But I think it doesn't necessarily be that, oh, if you want to have more economic development, you will necessarily have less nature. Thank you.
Good morning, colleagues. My name is Tijen Arın. I will be talking to you about how at the World Bank we are making macroeconomic models more nature-aware to inform our lending portfolio and overall policy dialogue with client governments. So there you go. Specifically, I will be talking about yes, how indeed macroeconomic models inform our dialogue. The fact that more recently these economic models have been enhanced to take into account climate impacts, but still don't quite incorporate nature. At the same time, we are now engaged in a task to make them nature aware so that we can assess policies that have an impact on nature. This is a challenging endeavor, so it's not, we cannot have a short-term perspective, but I'll be talking about our strategy to deal with the challenges. At the World Bank, we work every 4 years or so, we work with counterparts to develop what we call a country partnership framework. This document includes all the investments and also technical assistance that the World Bank will finance in the following 4 years. The document is informed by the country's development goals, specifically, of course, regarding economic development, employment, poverty reduction, fiscal balances. And it's also informed by diagnostic work we do at the World Bank, which is our macroeconomics, sectoral work, and most recently also the impact of climate. So in the past few years, the macroeconomic models that are most often used, oh, I should have said, I'm sorry, let me go back if I can, that's right. So macroeconomic models inform this dialogue, are an integral part of this diagnostic work, simply because macroeconomic models give a picture of an entire economy, the linkages between sectors, and how different shocks, policies impact sectors, and how that goes through the economy and results in GDP, or affects GDP, employment, income distribution, when, of course, coupled with other models. So recently, the key models have been enhanced to take into account climate impacts and climate policy. So specifically, these models now allow to consider the impact of climate change through damages, or through productivity changes. These models also allow to evaluate policies, mitigation policies and adaptation policies. Nature is incorporated to some extent where changes in land use have an impact on land-based emissions. Now, we would like to change this. We would like to give nature its central place in the economy. In a lot of countries, many sectors depend on nature. Climate has an impact on nature. Economic sectors have an impact on nature. And we would like to assess them. So, for example, we would like to assess how changes in land use impact, does this do it? No, sorry. Ecosystem services, which in turn will impact economic productivity. Take deforestation, for example, due to a shift in land to agricultural production, for example. For example, if you lose forests, that is likely to result in increased erosion, which then will lead to reduced land productivity, agricultural productivity. So it has an impact on the economy. But we look at downstream, 10 minutes, good. We look at, the macroeconomic model allows us to look beyond agriculture. So how does that translate into the productivity of other sectors, and then overall into the overall agriculture economic performance? But to give another example, if we lose mangroves, either due to economic development, let's say tourism development, you cut mangroves to make room for beaches or for aquaculture development, then you are actually becoming more vulnerable because you're reducing the protective function or service that mangroves provide. And of course, there is the emission or the carbon sequestration / emission reduction service. So once we have incorporated nature into macroeconomic models, we can also assess policies and investments that have an impact on nature, whether it's negative, the good kind of, the bad kind of policies or the good kind of policies. So to this end, we are now working with our macroeconomic modeler colleagues at the World Bank on a 2-year study or project with the aim to develop a methodology or develop methodologies to incorporate various ecosystem services into these macroeconomic models. It follows on the, it's very similar to the global model that we heard about yesterday, the Earth economy model, where ecosystem services were incorporated. But now we're doing this at the country level. So one of the pillars is to prepare standard protocols so that country economists can use these models in their diagnostic work to inform the country work. And then we are also working on developing a strategy to mainstream the use of these models within the bank to overcome several challenges, and I'll talk about them. So just to mention, to incorporate ecosystem services, we link macroeconomic models with biophysical models. These are land use, land cover models and ecosystem services models. And these, the models then work in a dynamic, iterative fashion to evaluate policy and climate shocks. I said this will allow us to assess policies. So one of our pilots is India, where we have assessed 2 policies that India is considering to achieve its NDC goals and also to achieve its net zero emission goal. These are preliminary findings. We will be updating them, but this is just to illustrate what we're finding. And the ecosystem services we were able to incorporate include, let me start with the policies and the investments. These include large-scale investments in afforestation and agroforestry on barren lands on the one hand, and forest restoration in degraded forests. Thank you. And the ecosystem services we were able to incorporate include provisioning services, so forest products, as well as agricultural products in the case of agroforestry. As well as, importantly, regulating services. And those are the harder ones. So those include carbon sequestration, erosion reduction, and crop pollination. And as the lower table shows, we are able to predict, or not predict is the wrong word, we're able to assess the impact of these policies in terms of GDP, and the numbers here are cumulative numbers as of 2070. So GDP, consumption, investment, private investments, exports, imports. We also have employment numbers. I should point out, obviously these are not predictive models. These are tools. You may have heard, we're all constantly reminded that no model is correct, but models allow us to get a sense of how different interventions would perform comparatively. So they're a tool. They don't necessarily give us a prediction or tell us about the future. Well, we can also, importantly, we haven't done that yet. We are still working on it. In the case of India, we can also evaluate policies that change the incentive structure. Like we've talked about subsidies. What happens if there is a subsidy that encourages or that incentivizes a certain agricultural production? What impact will that have on land use? So we will be able to estimate endogenously the impact, the land use impact of such policies. So a number of different policies that impact incentives will be assessed. We can also, of course, assess other types of policies that are not necessarily incentive-based, but are on the stick side. So improved regulatory enforcement, for example, on land use changes. Yeah. There are links with the financial sector, especially as central bank nature risk assessments that has been mentioned. They use models that are very similar to nature-aware macroeconomic models to assess the vulnerability of the financial sector to biodiversity risks, for example. And we will talk more about these type of risks, I believe, later today. Yeah, so as I mentioned already, we're hoping to make it possible for our country economists to use these models. I have 1 minute, yeah. In their macroeconomic analyses, so that nature becomes part of the, chapter 1 in the core diagnostics. We know that ministers of finance pay attention to macroeconomic impacts, to employment, GDP. We want to bring nature to their attention and are using the nature-aware macroeconomic models for that purpose. And that would then, we hope, will allow larger investments in nature conservation. But there are challenges, and this is my last slide. It is actually not very straightforward to incorporate ecosystem services into economic models. So far, we've been able to incorporate the ones that I mentioned: provisioning services, carbon sequestration, sedimentation, flood reduction, erosion reduction, pollination. There are many others. We're working on coastal protection right now through mangroves. It will take time. And another big challenge is that national level data is limited. And we talked about that yesterday. Data meaning ecosystem services. Also ecosystem condition data are mostly not available except through global data sets. So it's a long-term endeavor. We have to start somewhere. We have started, but 2 years is not enough. So we are going to develop a plan to address these challenges. And one of our focus or priorities is to prioritize countries that do depend, whose economies do largely depend on nature. And also in those, we were hoping to use those countries to pilot the development, or to develop methodologies to incorporate ecosystem services that we haven't incorporated yet. I will stop here. Look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Can we give a round of applause to our amazing presenters? That, please, another round of applause. Thank you. They were good with time, and we're able to save roughly 20 minutes for your questions and answers, or for questions and answers. And during the presentation, I was thinking, what would be in the mind of the audience? What questions would they have? So that I can start it off. And I came up with 3 questions for each of the presenters, and hopefully that answers some of your burning questions. Otherwise, we have some time for additional questions. So, Charlotte, thank you very much for your presentation. And you can use this one. You explained how repurposing subsidies can have some unintended consequences. So my question to you today is, how do you minimize these unintended consequences? And how do you incentivize people or resource users to conserve fish resources? And to Professor Harding, my question is, okay, so I understand that a key result from your study is that forest loss increased when oil price fell. And I know there are a lot or several policymakers here today. So I wonder, how can they effectively realign incentives so that they can promote diversification while conserving nature and sustainability? And to Tijen, thank you very much. Your last slide was on challenges. And yesterday we heard a lot about the importance of data, and you highlighted how difficult it is to get some of the data you need for your model. So I would like to know what steps you're taking to ensure that the data you use to run these models are good quality and they actually tell good results and they would inform policies. So thank you very much. And I would like those questions to be answered in maybe like 2 to 3 minutes. So please be brief. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you hear me all right? Thank you. This is the mark of a good chair is you ask a question that sounds really simple, but it's actually very complicated. But I think you're going to the core of the issue. So indeed, I mentioned the fact that subsidies reform is a difficult proposition. It's a dangerous proposition. Why am I saying this? Because basically when we're saying we want to reduce or repurpose harmful subsidies, we are talking about taking away some livelihoods. And in the context of reducing poverty, which is the objective of the World Bank, that is one of the one things we want to avoid, is putting people out of work. Yet we also know that there are too many boats and they are being subsidized. So one of the main reasons why it's difficult is because most of the subsidies are not clearly understood or known. Let me give you an example. The biggest one probably in fisheries is petrol, subsidization of petrol for fishermen going out. And when you ask the governments, the first thing you ask is, what is your subsidy situation? In many circumstances, the government is not completely aware of the extent of these subsidies. So how to avoid? I think there is something that we are looking at, which again sounds simple, but is complicated, is compensating. So if we're going to put people out of work, Basically, we want to reduce the number of boats. And in economic terms, you know, there's going to be winners and losers. If you have fewer boats, if it's easier to catch, if the prices go up, those who stay in the fishery are going to be better off. The question is then, what happens to everybody who's been kicked out, if you will, of the fishery or phased out? And then the solution is for the winners to compensate the losers, which is, so in economic terms, we know that there's going to be enough rent generated, there's going to be enough benefits that the winners would be able to compensate the losers. The difficulty is what mechanism can we use? And I would just say, in very short, that one of the mechanisms that we are looking at is cash transfers. If you're going to be kicking out people, you need to compensate them.
Thank you very much. Professor Hardin?
Thank you for the great question. I think it will still be an open question after I speak now. But I'll say a couple of things. And I think it is important when you see this expansion of, say, agriculture. There is this economic motivation for expanding agriculture, say, when the real exchange rate depreciates. So this country becomes then more competitive in tradable goods, and you want to, for example, increase your production of maybe soybeans or maize or something like that. So if you can think of Brazil, which we have also studied in some of our projects, Lula, as I mentioned, had this huge package about policies. Some of them were quite restrictive, and basically fenced off, some parts of the forests for expansion. So that kind of hard constraint makes agriculture perhaps grow in other ways. So if policies are such that you force, for example, agriculture to become more productive rather than expanding land, that can be actually kind of a solution to this issue. So we know that there is huge potential in land productivity around the world. Brazil, I'm not claiming this is all due to Lula's policies at all, but at least this is an hypothesis that, some of these regulations restricting the expansion of land led to innovation in agriculture. We know there has been a huge innovation in agriculture in Brazil. For example, you saw the implementation of the genetically modified soybeans. It came from the US in the 90s, but it was implemented then in Brazil. And it really took off in some of these places where the regulations were very strict. You had another innovation, which was the double cropping. So they started to, instead of having one season a year, they managed to do 2 seasons, alternating between maize and soy, for example. So then increases land productivity massively. So if you can force the economic expansion into, for example, productivity improvements, then that actually can you avoid the land expansion, and yet also manage to increase production. So it's quite a fascinating story. Brazil used to be a dominant, one of the maybe top 2 soy exporters. Recently, over these last 20 years, they also became maybe top 2 or at least on the top list of maize exporters as well. So massive expansion of export-oriented agriculture, at the same time managing to protect quite a bit of its forests. So it's possible, but you kind of have to force the economic expansion, because the economic expansion is going to go there where it's cheapest. It's going to typically pick the cheapest way to expand, and you have to make that expansion that threatens nature expensive. I think that's my answer.
Thank you very much, Tijen.
Yeah, no, thank you for that question, Uju. So what we need to do in each country case is to first look for data, for national data, what data they have collected. They may not already be in the form of natural capital accounts or ecosystem accounts or what have you, one still has to go through, do a literature review, national literature review, and find appropriate data. Where we cannot find appropriate national data, then we will use global data, but we have to be careful. In particular, when it is about when the policies that we are evaluating have an impact on the condition of the ecosystem service and the productivity of an ecosystem, say forest, there one has to be very careful about to what extent global data sets reflect that. In the long term, we have to strive, we have to continue to support governments to generate national data, and that's what GPS is there for, and we are hoping to do more of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we will now take questions from the floor and also online. So we will take about 3 questions. Please introduce yourself before you speak. Thank you. And also direct your question to the speaker you want to respond.
Hi, nice talks. Thanks for that. Thorfinn, I'm going to direct this to you, but I think this is in general an observation. But as the card-carrying academic economist, I'm going to put this to you. So I'm Saumya, and I work for the bank. One of the things that I'm noticing in a lot of these talks since yesterday is there might be an implicit trade-off between trying to do better on biodiversity versus trying to do better on carbon. Because a lot of the things that we're seeing, including the things that you're talking about, making agriculture a bit more intensive in order to protect land, might help with the biodiversity story. But if what you're producing is maize and soybean, it's probably going into livestock production, which is a greenhouse gas problem. So how is it, I think this is a philosophical question and I'm not expecting an answer at the moment, but what I'm wondering about is this something we need to have a conversation about a bit more? Is it possible that in trying to solve the biodiversity issue, you end up sort of doing things that might not help with the carbon issue or vice versa? Thanks.
We'll take 2 more questions.
Okay, hi. Morning, I'm Michael Cusang from the ILO. And my question is really for Charlotte. The fishery problem that you outlined, to me, really sounds like a classic just transition problem, as we call in the ILO. There's a transition, there are winners and losers. How do we make the transition just and make it for everybody to win? So I was just wondering whether, for us, the basis of that is there's a technical side, but there's also the social dialogue side around it. And just curious what the dialogue and discussion processes with the stakeholders in the fishery sectors have been, and what the openness is among the different stakeholders to find a consensus on or possible solutions on the way forward. Thanks.
Last question.
I'm coming back to the fishery question. I've heard recently experience on aquatic parks. Is something in international water something to consider in this question? In this discussion, thank you.
So we have about 5 minutes left for this session. So I encourage the speakers to keep their answers.
Okay, I'll try to be quick then. So thank you very much for that question. It's an excellent question. I think it's high on the agenda. I think another example that comes to mind to me is, of course, when it comes to renewable energy, where we have a minister in Norway, for example, who says things like, "Oh, we have to destroy nature to save nature." So and the idea is to build a lot of windmills, for example, to reduce carbon emissions. I think what we think is possible today, we didn't see was possible 20 years ago or 50 years ago. I'm a bit of a technology optimist. I think if we regulate hard, makes it expensive, the stuff we don't like, I think there may be ways around it, I think also the economy will grow in other ways, you know. So I think we just have to be a little bit stricter in the sense that, you know, this we really have to stop, for example, when it comes to biodiversity loss, and regulate that hardly. And then there will be perhaps solutions. Maybe some of the stuff we just, you know, will realize is just too expensive. But I agree with you. Of course, there is a trade-off always. It's a difficult one, but we shouldn't underestimate this, you know, power of new technology, and also, you know, how and that I would, you know, address to the keynote today, that if, you know, the big picture of growth the last 200 years is not about, you know, using up nature. I mean, it is a bit of that for sure, but the big picture is really ideas, it's technology. That's what made us richer, you know, that we use the resources we have much more efficiently. And that's really the great power, right? So the pie thing is kind of dangerous, I think, because, you know, we can still grow and preserve nature, but, you know, we perhaps will need new ideas on the way. But that, you know, the last 200 years have told us that that was really possible.
I'm going to try not to speak too fast because I know that's a problem, but quickly. On the just transition, Michael, I believe. Yes, that's very much the next issue. And basically, you're pointing to the next step, which is, well, when we say we're going to repurpose, that means those subsidies that were driving the problem are going to be repurposed to solve the problem. And I think that's where the compensation comes in, the transition comes in. I'm just going to mention that the World Bank is starting a whole series of case studies all over the world, from Costa Rica to the Pacific, where we're looking at what does it look like. And we're actually working, the fisheries people are working with the social people. So this is very much front and center. It's very early. We'll exchange information, if you will, and I'm happy to keep you updated. On marine protected areas, yes, that's a very, very good question. In fisheries, you need some areas that just off limits that nobody can fish in. And again, I think this is a really good question, because what are the subsidies going to be useful if we transition them? Remember, I said we're not cutting the subsidies, we're transforming them. Marine parks are very expensive to run and to establish, and that's where we could repurpose the subsidies to finance them. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charlotte. We have one more question from the online audience. So, and I think it's fair for us to listen to this question. So, Charlotte, the question is for you, and it's about open access versus regulatory system. So the question is asking whether planned or I don't know why I'm finding it difficult to pronounce that word, but why planned systems are successful, and what is the compliance level to this regulation in countries?
Okay, so basically we're going back to the basic economics of fisheries, which is if you have complete open access, there's no incentive to control yourself. There's the idea that if you don't catch that last fish, somebody else is going to come in and take it. So this is what the study showed, is that basically the relative weight of subsidies reform and changing the open access nature of the regime varies. It's different in artisanal. Artisanal is going to be more forgiving, obviously, of open access, whereas large-scale industrialized is going to be more dire in terms of the consequences. But again, what we're saying is subsidies reform is necessary, but it's far from sufficient. And at the end of the day, you have to look at the management and access regime.
Thank you very much. So a resounding round of applause for our presenters. Thank you.
Okay, another round of applause also for our moderator, Dr. Uju. Thank you so much. So here's the plan. I see we all need a break. So we are going to take a break for 10 minutes. So we'll be back here at exactly 11 and then start the next session, poster session, at 11:05. In the meantime, I had a few announcements to make. One is that unlike yesterday, today you have your lunch coupons distributed to you. So how many have not got this? How many have got? Okay, so if you haven't got, please go back at the back there. You can, at the table back there, you can pick your lunch coupon because you'll not have lunch if you don't have it. Secondly, yesterday I announced that there were some souvenirs. How many people got souvenirs during dinner time? Some brown envelope. So just to give you a leakage of the exam, those were the photos, the group photos. So the World Bank team has made it available for each and every one of us to go home with a copy. So if you don't have copy, we still have some copies there. I feel free to pick. And then the following colleagues would also request you to go and see my colleague Abdu down there at the back. Elane, Tirtha, Simon, Levent, and Christine. Please go and see Abdu at the back. I think he needs to sort out some logistic stuff with your team. Okay, so we are requesting that when you go out, please come back with your coffee or tea so that we try to save on time. I know we are still on time, but it will be helpful. So within that next 10 minutes, let's do that. And then we start we are back here at exactly 11. At exactly 11:05, we start with the poster presentations. Enjoy your break.